Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for spending your lunch with us today. If you are in our, time. If you're not, well, thank you for spending this hour with us. We have a great presentation lined up. I guess let me just say thank you for ending Florida Bicycle Month with us in our webinar series. If you stuck through it with us, awesome. If not, we hope you do next year. My name is Alyssa Frank. I am the pedestrian bicycle coordinator here at the Palm Beach Transportation Planning Agency, and I have the great privilege of introducing our two presenters today. We have Ralph Bueller and John Pucher, and I will let both of them go ahead and introduce themselves.
Well, my name is John Pucher. I was a professor of urban planning at Rutgers University for almost 40 years, and thus the cap I'm wearing. My research has focused on public transportation, walking and cycling, and how these three modes can be combined to offer an integrated package of sustainable travel alternatives to the car. Most of my research has involved international comparisons of transport systems, travel behavior, and government transport policies. My interest in cycling evolved from 2.5 years of sabbaticals at the Transport Institute of the University of Münster, Germany. And in that city, 40% of all trips are made by bike. Since my sabbaticals in that city, which is so bike-oriented, I've been addicted to cycling and cycling research ever since. So it's all the fault of the Transportation Institute in the University of Münster.
Yes, and hello from me as well. My name is Ralph Bueller. I'm currently professor and chair of urban affairs and planning at Virginia Tech in Arlington, Virginia. My research focuses on determinants of daily travel behavior, which means how people get around if they walk, if they ride a bike, if they ride public transport, or if they drive a car, and then how that relates to the sustainability of the transport system, to the environment, equity, and the economy. As with John, most of my research is international comparative, studying what countries and cities can learn from each other. And now enough about us. Let's start with the presentation. I'm gonna share my screen here. Hold on one second. Okay, there are the slides. The presentation today is titled Cycling for Sustainable Cities, which is the same title as for our new book that came out in February. The book is a collaboration of over 40 authors from 5 continents and different disciplines, including policy, planning, public health, and engineering. The goal of the book is to explore how to make city cycling safe and convenient for everyone. Here you can see the cover of our book with many people cycling in the Netherlands. In the beginning, I want to take you through the book very briefly, because we do not have enough time in this 40-minute presentation to go into everything in detail. And then John will start taking it away into the focus of today's presentation. So very briefly, the book is divided into 3 main subsections. The first is an introduction and an overview, where we provide an overview of cycling trends internationally. Then the book focuses on specific important topics related to cycling, including bicycling and public health, the importance of cycling and safety, and within that, the importance of bicycling infrastructure that facilitates cycling for everyone. We do not only look at moving bicycles on infrastructure, but also at parking bicycles, as well as programs and policies that help promote cycling to supplement the bikeway infrastructure. Chapter 8 focuses on evaluating cycling policies and projects, while then chapters 9 and 10 look at the intersection of technology and bicycling. One chapter on e-bikes in Europe and North America, and the other one on the evolution of bike sharing. The following chapters then focus on specific groups of cyclists. The first one focuses on women and cyclists, looking at the gender gap in cycling, especially in countries with low levels of cycling. And then a chapter on children and cycling, and older adults and bicycling. This is then capped by an entire chapter on social justice, equity, and cycling. So if we promote cycling, how can we promote it that it is truly for everyone? This section is followed by country and city case studies. The first set looks at cycling in China and in India, and the next one at trends in cycling in Latin America. After that, we have a chapter on cycling in mega cities that are newcomers to bicycling, New York, London, and Paris, who have been successfully promoting bicycling. After that, we have a chapter on sort of the legacy large bicycling cities in Europe, Copenhagen and Amsterdam, what they have done and how they are doing now, which is followed by a study of two newcomer bicycling cities, Portland and Sevilla in Spain, who have started from a very low cycling level and have been very successful in promoting bicycling. The book ends then with one chapter on the important aspect of bicycling advocacy in promoting cycling, and then some lessons and a look towards the future. And now, enough about the book. Let's get into the presentation for today, and John will take it away.
So now for the fun part. Okay. But, given that sustainable is in the title of the book, it will not surprise you that we think cycling is an extremely sustainable mode of transportation. In a number of different respects. The word sustainability means more than just environmental sustainability. Environmental sustainability is really important, and cycling is certainly very environmentally friendly. Virtually no pollution at all, no air pollution. Well, except if you had some beans to eat maybe, and you're riding a bike, but that gives you extra propulsion energy, so you can't complain about that. But anyway, virtually no noise pollution, very little in the way of non-renewable resources. Although then jump to the bottom, it's pretty obvious it's also an mode. It's economically sustainable. It doesn't cost much for the individual. You can get a bike for not very expensive. It doesn't take that much to maintain the bike. And it also less expensive for the government. It costs the government much less to build bike lanes or bike paths than it does to build roadways. So it's economically sustainable for the individual and for society as a whole. One of the aspects of sustainability that's not so obvious is social sustainability. Because it's financially affordable, it means whether you're low income or high income, you can afford bicycling. And it provides essential mobility to lower income individuals in many countries of the world. Cycling is physically possible for most people. There are exceptions. There are people that cannot ride bikes, but it is not the case, as you'll see. Well, you won't see maybe the older adults chapter. I'm 70 years old myself, and it is definitely the case that in your 70s and 80s, you can still ride a bike, and that the health benefits, even for older adults, of riding the bike far outweigh whatever risks there are. And indeed, the overall health benefits of riding a bike for the society as a whole exceed whatever the risks are, the possible injuries or deaths in an accident, crash. They far exceed those the risks of getting hurt. So what might surprise you the most is the mental health and the social health benefits of cycling. In a survey, well, first of all, we have 6 public health professors contributing to this book, and they all documented this, that there are very significant mental and social health benefits of cycling. A survey of new cyclists in the United States during the COVID pandemic, what was found is half of all new cyclists said, when they were asked, they were cycling for their mental health, to improve their mental health and to reduce their stress. So if you see someone out there that looks really stressed out and mentally unstable, try to get them on a bike, and that might solve the problem. Well, in short, cycling is sustainable in every respect. It's just about I think it is, the perfect mode of transportation. Indeed, it's divine. And this is a photo I took when I was in Munster on sabbatical. This is indeed the way nuns get around. You don't have to be a nun to bike in Munster, but it doesn't hurt. So anyway, it is a divine mode of transportation. Well, given that it's so divine, I might wonder, well, why is it that English-speaking countries cycle so little? We must be ungodly or something. But anyway, if you look, it's just amazing, the difference. Only about 2% of trips are by bike in English-speaking countries. Australia, the United States, Canada, the UK, I mean, what is wrong with us, those of us who speak English? If you hop over the channel and you go over to the continent of Europe, much, much higher levels of cycling. So here, the Netherlands is the champion at 28%. But then you have the Denmark at 14%, Germany's 11%, 9%. And we went and included Japan, by the way, in here, and South 13%. I mean, that's a ratio of almost 30-1 between the Netherlands and the United States. But even just taking the European countries as a whole, maybe it's 6-1, 7-1. At any rate, much, much higher levels of cycling in these continental European countries. You might think, but you'd be wrong. You might think that the reason that Germans, Danes, and the Dutch make more bike trips than Americans is that trips here are just too long to make by bike. False. In fact, 40% of all trips in urban areas in the United States are 2 miles or less. And that's definitely a distance that could be covered by bike. So it's not an issue of trip distance. And we looked at this another way. We controlled for trip distance. If you look at this graphic, you can see what it does is it says controlling for trip distance. I don't know what you're doing, Ralph, go back. Controlling for trip distance, even controlling trip distance, that the Germans, the Danes, and the Dutch make much, much, much higher percentages of their trips by bike. Okay, Ralph. And now we have very hopeful news, and that is the following. There's been large increases in cycling in large cities around the world. If you look at Latin America, North America, and Europe, all of these cities listed here, they're very large cities. They're very important cities, often many capitals of their countries. And we have doubling, tripling, quadrupling. There's 2 groups of cities. We have a group of sort of lower cities that did not have a tradition, a culture, a legacy of cycling, such as Paris, New York, London. They just were not cycling cities. They were cities based on walking and public transit, and yet they have invested, as all of these cities have, enormously in better bicycling infrastructure and programs and parking to complement that. But there's also been impressive increases in those cities, these here 4 in Europe, Berlin, Munich, Copenhagen, Amsterdam. I mean, even there, from a high level, a very large in cycling. So the really good news and hopeful news from this slide is bicycling has been increasing a lot. And this is roughly since 1990, just roughly. So a big increases in cycling.
And we saw a little bit of the potential of more increased cycling during the COVID pandemic. This graph here is based on data from the company EcoCounter. They have bike counters in various cities in Europe and in North America. And it shows you the cycling levels by week of the year 2020 compared to 2019. So whenever these curves are above the 0 line, that's here at the middle of the graph, you have more cycling in 2020 than in 2019. If it's below, you have less cycling. And what we notice is there's a lot of fluctuation, but overall, the curves are above the 0 line. So there was more cycling in 2020 than in 2019. We noticed the big dips there where the arrow points to. These are declines during lockdowns that restricted travel severely, mainly in Southern European countries, including France or Spain and Italy, where lockdowns were quite severe and you couldn't leave your home, or you could only leave your home for very specific or important trips. So cycling dropped during those periods and then sort of skyrocketed afterwards. A couple more findings of a study that's not in the book, but we're doing this at the moment about the impacts of COVID on bicycling. First, as I said, we saw overall increases in cycling and also larger increases in cycling mode share. So the percentage of trips made by bike increased because the overall trip making fell so much by public transport and by driving. And as you saw already, there's lots of variability by month, by day, location, and by trip purpose. We saw large increases in cycling for exercise and recreation, and for stress relief and for socializing in a socially distanced way. We saw decreases for utilitarian cycling, that's cycling to work, to school, to university, mainly because people worked and learned from home. No surprise, the largest increases were during the weekends. There was less of an increase during the weekday, likely dampened by the missing commute trips to work, school, or university. And the missing commute trips you can see in the data very clearly in terms of the missing morning peak hour trips. Typically, when you look at the distribution of bike trips during a day, you have a peak in the morning. That's when people ride to work. It's a little bit lower throughout the day, and in the afternoon there's another peak. That morning peak is sort of gone during COVID times. That's people not cycling to work. The largest increases were in cycling on off-road recreational paths, and not surprisingly, many decreases were registered on routes that were used to commute to the central city or to university campuses. There were, as we saw in the graph before, decreases in cycling during the total lockdowns, but increases in cycling where lockdowns exempted cycling as a physical activity, and sharp increases in cycling after the strict lockdowns were lifted. This is a picture from the Rue de Rivoli, which saw fantastic levels of cycling outside of the lockdowns in Paris. And note how it has been made accessible almost entirely by bike. You have a bus lane on the side there. This is a bike lane installed in Montreal in Canada, part of 68 kilometers of new or improved facilities built during the COVID crisis, and it's so safe that entire families are using them to get physical activity.
We have a wonderful new chapter in this book on Latin America. We have three Latin American professors who helped write this chapter, and they are really the experts on Latin America. What you see in Latin America, these are various cities, and the percentage of trips by bike in each of these cities. There's no national survey for any country in Latin America, so all the data was on a city basis, but you'll see a huge variation from city to city. The most cycling of these cities is Bogota, Colombia is about 7%, Guadalajara, Mexico is 8%, about 5%. Cali or Rosario, but it goes all the way down to Valparaiso, 0.0%. You can't get much lower than that. That's even lower than the United States. In Quito, in Ecuador, which is the capital, 0.3%. The whole point is just a huge, huge range. But the really hopeful thing, the really good thing is that there has been a tremendous increase in cycling in some Latin American cities. Bogota is the most example, but and also Santiago de Chile have had big increases in cycling, and it's almost exclusively due to huge investments in completely separate and integrated bikeway networks. And it built in a period of just a few years. The Bogota, I think it was 3 or 4 years, they built over 150 kilometers of connected separate bikeways. China, we have a chapter on China and India, and I was deeply involved in that because in both China and India. China, they're the biggest, the most populous countries in the world, so we ought to look at them. And it turns out they have probably 10 times more bicycling than the rest of the world combined, which makes them another reason to include them as a chapter in the book. Unfortunately, as you probably know, cycling has been declining in most Chinese cities. And these are very, very big Chinese cities, Beijing, Shanghai, and so forth. But for cities throughout China, it varies from year to year. But the main reason for the decrease is that Chinese cities have enormously, and I do mean humongously, invested in new and expanded metro systems. It's amazing. And so public transport has become a huge competitor to cycling. And Chinese cities, as they've been getting larger, have been spreading out. So you really need public transport longer, and many of them can only be made by public transport. Bicycling becomes, it's just not, it doesn't cover long enough trips. So that's one reason. The other reason is a big boom in car ownership and use. Average incomes have increased a lot in China. And that has allowed people to buy more cars and to use cars. The other thing is now cycling used to be for everyone in China. It used to be the so-called cycling kingdom. Well, not anymore. And now cycling is seen as more a lower mode, sort of a stigma attached to cycling that only lower income people cycle. Next slide. China, another very important country, almost as populous as China. Lots and lots of variation. Overall, I guess that's the main point here. Overall, we have percent of trips in India made by bike. And that's a lot. I mean, 20% is more than the percentage in Denmark or Japan. Only the Netherlands has a higher percentage, they have 28% compared to India at 20%. So it's a very high percentage. It's somewhat higher in rural areas, believe it or not, than in urban areas. Distances are shorter in rural villages than they are in big cities. But the big differences here among these cities, and just look at the three biggest cities, Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, and you see Mumbai has 2% and Kolkata has 10 times more, 23%. Part of the reason is higher average incomes in Mumbai. It's the financial center of India than you have in Kolkata. The other reason is you have much better public transport in Mumbai and much worse public transport in Kolkata. The other issue is low-income people in Mumbai. The largest low-income area is right next to the downtown where the low-income people have their jobs, whereas in Kolkata, they're sort of more spread out. But whatever the reason, you can see there's a lot of variation, but the bicycling is definitely a lower income. It's a mode of transportation that is associated with lower income people who can't afford a car or public transit or some other way of getting around. Both in China and India now, cycling is more for lower income people.
So if we want to promote cycling, we have to promote it in a way that it is feasible for everyone. That includes all ages. And these pictures here show you that you can cycle from a very young age, even with a special bicycle with 3 wheels, or if you're very proficient at cycling at a young age on just 2 wheels. It of course also includes cycling at older age for seniors, as we see in the lower right hand there, going out for a bike ride, or even with a special bike with 3 wheels that provides extra space to transport luggage. So cycling is feasible at all ages. This looks at cycling by age group for the countries that we analyzed in the graphs before. And as you can see, in every country, the percentage of trips by bike is the highest for the group that's not at driving age yet. So the youngest age group makes the highest share of their trips by bicycle in each country. If we then look over here, in the US and in Canada, much lower levels for all age groups. And with increasing age, bicycling drops. And at the age group of 70 plus, we are below 1% of trips made by bicycle. If we look over to the other countries, we see that cycling still drops after the youngest age group, but then it stays relatively stable. In Japan, it hovers around 12% for all age groups. In Germany, around 10. In Denmark, it sort of declines, but it's still at 10 or above 10%. And then in the Netherlands, it stays relatively high, and even the age group 70 plus, they make a quarter, 25% of all of their trips by bicycle. So you can truly cycle at all ages if you provide the right infrastructure and environment to do so. Another big difference internationally is the share of women of bike trips made by women. This shows you here that in Australia, the UK, the US, and Canada, only between 1/4 and 1/3 of bike trips are made by women, while in the other European countries and Japan shown here, the balance is about 50-50 or even a little bit higher for women. So we have to do something to fill that gap because women account for half of the population, so they should make half of the bike trips. These are 2 pictures from Denmark and the Netherlands, where women account for about 50% of bike trips in those countries. Another trend we have observed over the last years, and also particularly during COVID, is the growth in e-bike sales. Europe is leading the US, and there's also variability across the countries. You see Germany all the way to the right, with the most e-bikes sold there, followed by the Netherlands, and then followed by the US. But if you were to adjust by population, the US would be probably at the end of this distribution. But nonetheless, in all of these countries, strong growth in e-bike sales, and e-bikes are typically pedelecs, which means you have to pedal, and then you get electric assist. In some other countries, mainly in China, e-bikes often have just a throttle without pedals. If that's then still a bicycle, we can probably debate in the Q&A later, but the bikes we're looking at here are mainly these pedelecs.
Probably the most important factor in getting people on bikes is making cycling safer. That in the United States, as an example, I would say maybe 70% of Americans are terrified of the very idea of getting on a bike. They just think it's very unsafe. So it's very important that we make cycling safer, and that we convey the impression of the fact that in fact it is being made safer. It's especially important for anyone who's risk averse, including me, by the way. I'm also 70 years old, so I suppose that makes me vulnerable and risk averse. But for young people, for children, their parents obviously are not going to let them go out there and bike if they think it's dangerous. For older adults, there is a fear of cycling, and they're just more risk averse. I know I am. For anyone with disabilities, and so forth. Women are also, all surveys show that women are more sensitive to cycling safety than men. So it's really an important aspect of public policy, government policy, to provide the really safe, convenient, and comfortable and safe feeling cycling infrastructure to encourage children and their parents, women and older adults to ride their bikes. And if you look at the Netherlands, Germany, and Denmark, the safety of cycling there is one of the reasons that you have such high levels of cycling. And this shows the relationship between levels of cycling and safety. There's something called safety in numbers, which says the more cycling there is, the safer cycling becomes. There's sort of a number of mechanisms behind this, but one is the more cyclists there are, the more likely a motorist is also going to be a cyclist and therefore be aware of the needs of cyclists and try to avoid endangering cyclists, something that doesn't happen here in the United States, unfortunately, but definitely happens in the Netherlands. The other issue is cyclists, when there's more of them, become more visible. If you have 20 cyclists on the roadway, the motorist is going to realize, okay, those are cyclists. In the United States, you'll see one or two here or there, and they won't be as visible. And visibility is key to any sort of transportation safety, including pedestrian and cycling safety. But there's the other issue. It works in the other direction. The safer the cycling is, the more cycling you get. Again, because cycling safety is a very important determinant in whether or not someone gets on a bike at all. So on the one hand, more cycling leads to safer cycling. On the other hand, safer cycling goes to more cycling. It goes in both directions. And wow, are there differences among countries? As usual, the US is the worst, absolutely the worst. And we're getting worse. So 2 points here, and that is that the United States is 6 times, we calculate this per 100 million kilometers cycled. This is fatalities per 100 million kilometers cycled. That rate per kilometer, the fatality rate is 6 times higher per kilometer in the United States than it is in Germany, Denmark, or the Netherlands. It's about 4 times higher than the UK. 4 times higher than the UK. And the other thing I would just note is in these other countries, the UK, Germany, Netherlands, things have been getting safer over time. Look at the UK, it's gotten 3 times safer. In Germany, it's gotten twice as safe per kilometer. Whereas look at the United States, it did get somewhat safer over the first 2 time periods, but then in the last time period, it's gone up from 4.5 to 6. And I mean, no matter which way you measure this, whether it's per trip, per kilometer, no matter how you measure it, cycling has just gotten more dangerous. And the reason, by the way, is not the fault of bicycling. It's that the levels, it's a more huge SUVs, sport utility vehicles, minivans, big increase in motor vehicle traffic in the United States, but also a huge increase in the size of motor vehicles. Almost everyone has a pickup truck or a big SUV. So anyway, if you want to have a really safe cycling trip, you got to think of what they're doing in the Netherlands, Denmark, or Germany. And one of the things they're doing is they're providing more physical separation between motor vehicles. And I think we need to do the same thing in the United States. Okay, so I was also involved in the chapter comparing it what's going on in bicycling in New York, London, and Paris, three very, very important cities. And you'll see here some really good things happening, the best in Paris, but even in these cities had no tradition at all of bicycling. I mean, they just didn't. People walked and took public transit, and bicycling just was not sort of on the radar screen. If you look at New York, they invested lots. I mean, they built, maybe 500 kilometers or more of new cycling facilities, and pretty much the same is true in London and Paris. A huge investment in new cycling facilities, also in bike sharing programs and all sorts of other complementary programs. So we have about a 3 to 4-fold increase of bicycling in New York over this roughly 3 decades. In London, it's a doubling in the percentage of trips by bike. But again, Paris is the winner. I think it's an 11-fold increase or 12-fold increase in bicycling in Paris. And they have been extremely successful in Paris. And at the same time, and it just confirms that graph we saw earlier, as you increase cycling, you decrease the fatality rate and the serious injury rate. So this graph is showing both rates of fatalities as well as serious injuries. And in every one of these three cities, you see a very, very dramatic decline in both fatalities and serious injuries. Paris is the winner. If you look at Paris, I mean, even New York's made progress. Look at the fatality rate going from 28 down to 12. So it's less than and half as dangerous as it was back in 2000. But cycling in New York is still 4 times per kilometer. It's 4 times more dangerous than it is in Paris. So, but the main issue here is that you have, again, this phenomenon. As you get more cycling, you have safer cycling. And as you have safer cycling, you have more cycling. And here are 3 iconic pictures. You recognize, I hope, Big Ben, the Eiffel Tower, and the picture of New York is a very typical picture. It's not iconic, but it's a very typical sort of street scene in New York City. And you'll see in every single one of these cases, these are physically separated, protected bikeways, totally protected from these motor vehicles. And then at intersections, there's all sorts of special accommodations to cyclists. So you have special, as you can see in the New York picture, you have special traffic lights for bicycles. You have no left turns at certain intersections for cars, or depending on the direction of traffic, no right turn, no left turn for cars, and a number of accommodations. So it's really important that these 3 cities invested so heavily in improving bicycling infrastructure, and especially separating from motor vehicle traffic.
So how do cities encourage cycling? John already mentioned the better bicycling facilities, and you can see this list with all sorts of other policies and things that were implemented to make cycling safer and more convenient, and to increase cycling levels. And we'll take you through some of these in the next slides. This slide here sort of replicates the safety in numbers that John has talked about, but it also adds the bicycling facility supply in it. So here you see for the cities displayed there in a 20 to 30 year time period, the percentage growth in kilometers of bicycling facilities, so bike lanes and bike paths and cycle tracks built. The darker color then adds the growth in bicycling. So all of these cities that have expanded the bike infrastructure have seen increases in cycling. The variability here also depends on if the city already had a large network of bikeways that they extended, or if they started from scratch. And then, with no exception, in all of these cities, the fatalities and severe injuries relative to the cycling levels have fallen. So cycling has gotten safer per mile cycled in all of these cities. We've also seen a trend in the United States towards more protected bike lanes. This is data collected by People for Bikes, and it shows a 13 to 14-fold increase in the mileage of protected bike lanes in the US between 2006 and 2018, and almost all of them are in large cities, many actually in New York City. This shows you a couple of pictures of what these protected bikeways look like. John showed some from Paris and London and New York already. On the upper left, we have Copenhagen. Typically there, the cycle tracks are curb separated with a small curb from traffic. Throughout the intersections, they've chosen this bright blue color. In Bogota, Colombia, they are using these yellow caps, they call them, to avoid for cars to drive into the cycle tracks. In Sevilla, Spain, they have put a fence there to separate car travel from the cyclists. And then in Montreal, which was the first large North American city to have a network of cycle tracks, they're using these concrete curbs, as you see here on the left, to protect cyclists from motor vehicle traffic. This are pictures from Sydney and Brisbane in Australia, again having cycle tracks that are separated with these planter beds from car traffic, making it feasible to cycle for everyone. And then in the upper left, we see a bridge. Bridges are very important in bikeway networks across rivers or across highways, because otherwise, if they wouldn't be provided, cyclists couldn't even cross. You wouldn't be able to share lanes with fast moving high volumes of traffic on these city bridges. The bridges are very important in the networks. A new phenomenon in bikeway infrastructure are so-called bicycle expressways. We see some examples here from Germany and from China. Bicycle expressways can be in cities, but typically also go out into the hinterlands of cities. They're typically separated from pedestrian traffic, and importantly, they do not cross roadways at grade. So whenever you cross a larger roadway, you have either a tunnel or you have a bridge to allow cyclists to cycle through. That A, speeds up cycling, and B, removes the danger of crossing these major roadways. The picture in the center from Beijing, China, shows actually an elevated urban cycle track that's that doesn't use any tunnels or bridges. It's just elevated above the road network of the city. This here shows you the bike path and lane network of the city of Amsterdam in red. If you look very closely, you see some orange color. These are their plans for expansion of the network. This is a mature bicycling network. You can get from A to B in the city, from almost anywhere to anywhere, without cycling alongside a fast moving or high volumes of motorized traffic. And on top of this network, you also have traffic calmed, we'll talk about that in a second, neighborhood streets where cyclists can comfortably share the road with motorists. Many cities aspire to have a network like the one we just showed in Amsterdam. Here's an example of how this has been happening. On top, we see the network in Portland, Oregon. In black are their bikeways. On the bottom, we see Sevilla in Spain, and the bikeways there are colored in green. If we look on top, within the first decade, there was a big expansion between 1990 and 2000 of bikeways in Portland, alongside with increasing cycling levels. And in only 3 years, if you look at the bottom, Sevilla, Spain built a big network of bikeway infrastructure. And then fast forward another 15 years, you see how the bikeway network in Portland has gotten much, much denser with associated increases in bicycling levels. We also see how the network in Sevilla, Spain has gotten more denser. And both cities have sort of gone from being no cycling city at all to having a bike mode share somewhere between 6 and 8% of trips. A new focus in bikeway networks is on intersections, so not just providing bikeways along the links, the roadways of the network, but also at the intersections. This is a Google Maps shot from Salt Lake City in Utah with an import of a Dutch protected intersection. And I'll take you through this very quickly. The main feature of these intersections are these safety islands, as we dub them here. What they do, I'll explain now. So if a motorist starts here, gets a green light, they want to make a right-hand turn, they are forced to, because the radius of the curve is changed, they're forced to turn very slowly and progress quite a ways into the intersection before they can turn. What that does is it increases the visibility for the cyclists. So drivers are slow and they can see the cyclist to the right. If there would be a crash here, the speed is slow, so both cyclist and driver could avoid the crash, or if the collision happens, it's not as severe. Some of these intersections also have advanced green lights or leading green lights for bicyclists, allowing them to get into the intersection before the cars are starting. And then, of course, the cyclist could continue up here, or they could continue across the roadway. Also notice, because of the two safety islands here, the time or this distance where cyclists cross the roadway, where cars are, or trucks, is much shorter. So it's a shorter distance where they are exposed to a potential threat. Once they are over here, they can continue cycling on straight, or they can start queuing here, waiting for a green light to then cross across this safety intersection.
Traffic calming of residential neighborhoods is a very important government measure undertaken in most European cities. 78% of all neighborhood streets in the Netherlands are traffic calmed, 80% in Berlin, 80% in Vienna. It's a very common approach, traffic calming, meaning in Europe anyway, about 30 kilometers an hour or less. There are some pockets within traffic calmed neighborhoods that are maybe 7 or 8 kilometers per hour. They're called sort of Woonnerven or Spielstraßen, play streets. But there have been several studies that have been undertaken, and they show that sort of before and after the traffic calming, that the traffic calming unquestionably has a drastic reduction in the number of pedestrians and cyclists who are injured or killed. And so traffic calming is really a key strategy for improving walking and cycling safety. And 30 kilometers per hour is really the key, as you can see in this graph. Once you go beyond 30 kilometers an hour, if you get hit, your likelihood of getting killed increases. And my goodness, once you're up to 35 miles an hour, which is about, I guess, 55 kilometers an hour, you've had it. I mean, it's like a 90%, 95% chance you're going to be killed. So traffic calming is really important. You want to reduce through traffic from neighborhoods and reduce the speed of that traffic. These are just some examples of bike boulevards, which is a kind of traffic calming that's been introduced a lot actually on the West Coast, in Portland, Vancouver, actually also in Guadalajara, Mexico. That's also West Coast, I believe. And it's a combination of the traffic calming, so slower speeds, but it also prioritizes cycling. So you have a cycle, say a main cycling route, and you have stop signs sort of on the perpendicular streets. So it tries through cut throughs and arranging the stop signs and the traffic schedules in such a way that you facilitate certain cycling routes through neighborhoods. So this is a big development, mainly on the West Coast.
Another important element is integrating bicycling with public transportation and providing for bike parking. Integration with public transportation takes mainly two forms. One is to take the bicycle on the vehicle. This can be done with bike racks in front, as shown here in Minneapolis, or being allowed to take the bicycle on the vehicle itself, which is often restricted to off-peak hours. The other element is to park your bicycle at transit stops. We see on the upper left the bike parking garage in Washington, D.C. at the main train station, and in the middle from Groningen, and many more bikes than in D.C., bike parking at the train station there. Bike parking is important for cyclists, to feel safe for themselves while they lock their bike and unlock their bike, but also to not worry about the bike being stolen or being exposed to the weather. Bike parking can take many forms. We can have fancy bike parking garages, as we see in Freiburg there. It can just be bicycling corrals. That's where car parking is taken out and bike parking is put in. Or it can be like we see here in Nagoya in Japan, where you enter your bicycle into a machine. The bike is parked automatically underground or above ground, depending on how the facility works. And you can retrieve your bike in a very short time by entering a code. Cities also implement many other measures to promote bicycling. Ciclovías are events where entire roadways are closed to motorized traffic on weekends, certain days, certain hours, or entire weeks, and the roadway space is given over to bicyclists, pedestrian, rollerbladers, etc., to experience that space while it's not used for car moving or car storage. Bike sharing programs have shown to attract different users than regular cyclists. A big advantage of bike sharing is that you don't have to worry about bike theft, you don't have to worry about bike maintenance, and you don't have to worry about bike storage at home because you can just leave them at the docking stations or with the dockless ones just anywhere in the city or in designated places. Many workplaces, but also states have a Bike to Work Day and other promotional programs. Bike to Work Day in the US is typically in May, where people are enticed to commute to work by bike, and then because they have a good experience, continue it throughout the year. The same can happen with bike to school days or bike to school events, making routes safe to encourage children to ride their bike to school. Of course, you have to provide parking at school then as well. In Germany, the Netherlands, and Denmark, most school children get bike training in school between 3rd or 4th grade. It's part of their curriculum. In the US, bike training is mainly voluntary for children. I think the District of Columbia is the only so-called state that requires bike training in 2nd or 3rd grade at the moment. There's also bike training for adults, especially important in countries where many adults haven't ridden bikes in a long time. They may have ridden as children and stopped, and now they want to ride again. And if there are training courses for them, it gives them the confidence and the knowledge to ride a bike. Of course, you also have to train motorists about the rights to the road that pedestrians and cyclists have. And unfortunately, motorists often don't know that. In Europe, the training is more rigorous when it comes to the rights of pedestrians and cyclists. Here in the US, it's much more lax, and motorists often do not know about the rights of pedestrians or cyclists. So that has to be included in the training. And then last, many cities use so-called bicycle accounts, which were sort of originate from Copenhagen in Denmark, where they track on a biannual or annual basis the extent of the bikeway facilities, the percentage of trips made by bike, bicycling safety, but also combining it with surveys, the impressions of the population and of cyclists about these facilities. And they're making these they're designing benchmarks according to these criteria to facilitate policy making.
I want everyone to, whoa, back, Ralph, back. Back, Ralph.
It doesn't want to go back.
Oh,
no, it goes. There it is.
There we go. Okay, I want everyone to look in the upper left. That's the Easter Bunny. Easter comes in a few days, so that's the Easter Bunny in Bogota, Colombia. Okay, go on. Implementation strategies. Academic ideas are great. I mean, there's hundreds of people doing research out there on bicycling, but the best ideas are worthless unless they're implemented. And so it's really important. We have a whole chapter of the book about implementing the right kinds of policies. One of this thing is you have to convince the public this makes sense. And so you have to teach the public, publicize to the public, and quantify them, the individual and societal benefits. I mean, tell people you're going to live longer and healthier if you bike. You'll be even more mentally healthy. You'll be socially healthy. You'll be physically healthy. And even if you don't bike, the air is going to be cleaner and there'll be less global warming and so forth. I'm not going to go through all of these, but one essential thing is to build alliances with politicians. Like them or not, politicians are pretty important for getting policies implemented, for the funding and for approving laws that are needed to build the cycling facilities, but also setting up things such as bicycling training, motor vehicle training, traffic laws, and so forth. It's really crucial that bicycling advocates at all levels, local, state, federal, or national, get together with politicians. And actually many politicians are in favor of cycling, but they need that support that's provided by advocacy groups at every level. And believe you me, they really do, because these advocacy groups, and there's a lot, they sort of help get that public support behind the kinds of pro-bike policies, and that then makes it more likely that the politicians are able to implement them. If there's something extremely controversial that you're going to, something new you're going to do, whether it's traffic calming, setting up car-free zones, at least that in the United States is new. It's not new for Europe, but it's new for the United States. Try it out in one area and you'll see the success, and then sort of let it go from there. Build 1 or 2 bikeway facilities, these cycle tracks or protected bike lanes. You see how well it's used and how much safer it is, and then you can expand upon that success. and benchmarking. But the summary lessons, and then we'll sort of wrap this up. Cycling infrastructure is crucial. It's by no means sufficient. You have to combine it with all sorts of other programs and policies, especially auto-restrictive policies. But it's absolutely essential that you have good, connected, well-designed, well-maintained bicycling infrastructure that feels comfortable and safe for everybody, all age groups, children, older adults, and women as well as men. And to integrate, again, these infrastructure policies with programs that we described in detail earlier. The last point I'll just make is we should really, or one of our goals should be making cycling possible, convenient, safe for everybody, for all ages, for all abilities. And throughout this book, by the way, we examine issues of social justice and equity. We have an entire chapter on that, which is just on that topic, but we asked every single chapter author, no matter what their particular topic, please examine in your topic area the issue of equity and social justice. And if you'd like to know more about any of this, you might want to take a look at our book, Cycling for Sustainable Cities. Thank you very, very much to each and every one of you who's put up with us, especially me, talking so much. Sorry that we went over.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you guys so much for such a great presentation. There was a ton of really informative just data in there. Some really good tips on planning for sustainable transportation. So to close this out, I would like to spend the last 10 minutes of this with some Q&A, questions and answers. Attendees, you guys all on the bottom of your screen have the ability to raise your hand. So I'm going to ask you to do that. And I will go through and call you guys and let you speak. What I do ask is, since we do have such a wide variety of people from all over the world in this with us today, I would like to hear everyone just introduce themselves, name, and just where you are, if you're in the States, the state, and the country, or the state. And if you are outside of the United States, please just state the country you're from. But let's go ahead and do Q&A. The first question I have is from Louis Merlin. I'm gonna allow you to talk. You might have to unmute on your end.
Hey, I want to say hi to John and Ralph. I know both of them personally. You guys have done a fabulous job with this book, and I can't wait to read it cover to cover. I'm in Florida. I'm at Florida Atlantic University. Here's my question for you, and it's a bit of a tough one, which is, here in Florida, we have on almost every major street an unprotected bike lane. Sometimes it's quite wide, sometimes 4, 5, 6 feet, but it's unprotected, and sometimes it's on streets where cars are traveling 50 miles per hour or more. And I wanted to hear what you think about that as a policy of putting unprotected bike lanes on very high-speed roadways.
We have the same problem here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I'm not even sure they're 4 to 5 feet wide. And there are cars whizzing past you at 45, 50, 55 miles an hour. I just will not ride on such bike lanes. So, I mean, again, I'm risk averse. I'm 70 years old, but I just would rather have the money invested in protected bike lanes and have fewer total miles than have, I mean, the city of Raleigh has done this. I mean, and I'm not criticizing the city of Raleigh because they are starting to build protected bikeways, but we have lots of unprotected bikeways on fairly high speed arterials, 45, 50 miles an hour because motorist speed. And I very rarely see motorists, I mean, very rarely see cyclists on those facilities, whereas on off-road greenways, they're overcrowded because people feel safer and they're very, very heavily used. So I'm not sure the solution is to get rid of them. At the very least, I would hope that the cities would put in at least protective buffer strips. Maybe they can't put physical barriers, but maybe at least put in maybe a foot of one of these diagonally striped buffer strips would be better at least than nothing.
Yeah, and in several European countries, according to the design guidelines, you wouldn't get this type of facility matched with fast-moving and high volumes of motorized traffic. You would, in the Netherlands, for example, you would have a separate bikeway that's physically separated at these speeds. So I think they're well intentioned because they give a space to bicyclists, but they are not the right design measure for the type of facility, at least the way you describe it. So they should be more separated or provide more protection to get people like John to ride there as well.
Thank you for that answer and that question. Next, I am going to call on Erin O'Mellan. You might have to, I'm allowing you to talk. You might have to unmute.
Well, Erin's from Vancouver, British Columbia. She's the head of Hub Cycling in Vancouver, and she's wonderful. So I'll introduce Erin for you.
Thank you, John. That's wonderful. I love that introduction. Yes, I'm with Hub Cycling Metro Vancouver. My question is there new data since 2000 showing the impact of promotion and education on mode share versus cases where only infrastructure was added?
Over to you, Ralph. I let Ralph answer all the difficult questions.
But this is indeed a difficult question. We have one chapter in the book that looks at programs and policies, and it's very hard to isolate the effects of these policies because they're typically not implemented on their own. They're often implemented when bikeways are built or when other measures are implemented. So together, combined as a package, they increase bicycling, but I haven't seen many good and solid studies that specifically focus on one of these promotional events and single them out as the main reason for increasing cycling. And part of it is the difficulty to disentangle their effect. Maybe John knows more on it, but that's sort of what this chapter shows.
I think, I'll just say one point is one of the reasons it's so difficult to isolate the impact of one of these is I was working with Susan Handy at the University of California, Davis, and also with Jennifer Dale in Portland. And we were examining all these different policies, infrastructure policies, programs, and we found it almost impossible to separate them out. And the reason is that a really successful promotional package, I guess that's the point, you need an integrated package of mutually reinforcing policies, programs, and infrastructure to really have an impact. So, and the more successful a city integrates its package of infrastructure policies and programs, the more difficult it is for academics to try to separate out what is the impact of education, the impact of training programs, the impact of higher penalties for motorist violations of pedestrian cyclist rights. It's just, they're inseparable almost. And so, and also the problem is it's with infrastructure, it's easier to measure it because you can do something before and after. It's just an easier thing to do. With programs, it's like, I don't know, they take time, and it's not a matter of just measuring, okay, this is the level of cycling before that bike lane was built. This is the level of cycling afterwards. Usually these programs of various kinds are longer term, and they're just more difficult to quantify. So it's very difficult.
And let me add, and it's not a program, but there are studies on showing that bike parking is effective at increasing cycling among current cyclists and among prospective cyclists. There also is evidence on the different types of bike parking, how they influence cycling. So a greater level of protection and security increases cycling. If you charge for it, it drops again a little bit. Also, if you provide showers and lockers at work along with bike parking, you're more likely to cycle to work than if you only have bike parking there. But they're more infrastructural measures than programs.
Right. Well, thank you so much for drawing out not just the infrastructure and the other pieces too. I appreciate that.
I'd like to make one point, if I may, and that is, speaking of non-infrastructure issues, I have a colleague, Jan Gerard in Melbourne, Australia, and she took a study tour of Denmark and the Netherlands. And she gave me a really interesting impression. She said, well, she knew cycling was going to be safer and feel safer in the Netherlands. And she expected the bicycling infrastructure to be top rate, superb. Now, that wasn't a surprise. The thing that surprised her the most was how motorists drive vis-a-vis cyclists. That when she was on a bike, She had never in her life, in Australia, most motorists are sort of homicidal towards cyclists. And in the Netherlands, she said motorists were constantly watching out for cyclists, yielding to cyclists, being sure they did not endanger cyclists. And one of the reasons for that is by law. In the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Denmark, if a motorist hits a cyclist, it is assumed to be the legal responsibility of the motorist. And the only exception to that is if you can prove that the cyclist deliberately caused the accident. Believe me, that is not the situation, unfortunately, in the United States, because if it were, half of Americans would be in jail. And so I think that I was really, really impressed at Jan's remark that sort of the way motorists are trained in the enforcement, and that's key, the enforcement of laws, traffic laws, where motorists are required to yield to cyclists and to not endanger cyclists. Those laws are really enforced in Germany, in Denmark, in the Netherlands. Here in the United States, you're on your own. I mean, I've never seen a police officer ever give a ticket to a motorist for having endangered a cyclist. And in fact, in 95% of the cases where cyclists are killed, there's not even a citation issued by the police. I mean, it's like motorists get away with murder in the United States. Well, I'm sorry, I'm getting off track, but I think it's important. We didn't really mention it very much in this talk, but I think one of the key problems in the United States, and I do include Florida, you poor folks down there, and it's even worse here in North Carolina. I mean, if the police don't enforce the laws that are meant to protect cyclists, it's no wonder that motorists drive the way they do. Sorry for that bad news.
It's okay, it's all fact. Okay, so next question I have from Mr. Tom Bogdanowitz. I'm gonna unmute, and I do still have a couple questions after this, so we are gonna go over 1 o'clock a little bit. I hope that's okay.
I'll introduce Tom for you. Tom is with the London Cycling Coalition. He's wonderful. He's done a great job promoting cycling in Greater London. Welcome, Tom.
Yes, thank you very much for a great webinar. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. There are two things which I didn't find in the book, which we've innovated in London, which are both to do with lorries or trucks, as you call them. Basically, the problem in London is that 50% of the fatalities of cyclists and 20% of the fatalities of pedestrians on the roads involve trucks. And to address this, we've done two things. We've introduced something called a direct vision standard, which means that lorries, trucks entering London have to have far increased visibility, or they have to have special cameras and audio alerts. And the other thing we've done is that we've introduced driver training. So drivers of trucks are expected to get on their bicycles or get on loaned bicycles and experience life as a cyclist on the roads. And the two things are helping to reduce the fatalities associated with trucks. And I know that the European Union has now accepted the direct vision standard for trucks with far greater visibility. And I wondered whether anything like that was being considered in the United States, where you obviously have trucks which also have poor visibility.
I don't know if it's being considered here, but I think it's an utterly fantastic idea. It is also the case here in the United States that a larger percentage of those fatalities of cyclists are due to large vehicles, including trucks. Ralph, are you aware of any plans by the federal government to introduce these standards?
No, I'm not aware of it, but they may be. But visibility or some audio detection is very important for cyclists to be safe around trucks. I know that in Canada, and maybe that has been implemented, there was a discussion a couple of years ago to require trucks to sort of have a side protection, that when trucks turn, that pedestrians and cyclists cannot be sort of drawn underneath the vehicle, but I don't exactly know how that went. The driver training you mentioned, is a good idea to put truck drivers on bicycles. That has been used in some US cities with traffic engineers to do bicycle rides with traffic engineers, that when they are designing the roadway the next time, that they have experienced the road from a cyclist perspective. And it's sort of the same idea as the one you described here, that the truck driver or the traffic engineer then knows what the world looks like from a bicycle seat.
Tom, what you described is an utterly fantastic idea. I mean, I wish, I mean, I will do what I can do to broadcast that idea here in the United States. I think it is really just brilliant. I think it's wonderful. We need to get it politically implemented. We really need to let people know about what's going on, and that it reduced significantly cycling, that it had a very good effect. It reduced cycling fatalities. Tom, that is just a fantastic idea.
Thanks for that comment. I do have two more questions left. One is the one we'll go with next is from Carlton Reed. I will allow you to talk, and I'm just going to need you to unmute on your end.
Okay, I've unmuted.
Yep.
I think. Yeah,
Yep,
yep.
you are.
Yes, thank you. And I'll echo Tom as well. Thank you for that fantastic webinar, Ralph and John. And long may it continue, and may your book flourish out there and do great things. However, I'd like to ask about an American example. So you've got Mayor Pete, who's appears to be doing great things, and we're certainly looking forward to him doing great things. He's certainly talking the talk. Do you think he'll walk the walk? Do you think he will genuinely change things in the US?
I certainly hope so. Given all of the, I can't remember how many trillions of dollars the Biden administration is planning to spend. I mean, not just the stimulus funds, but then on specifically transportation infrastructure, there should be money there for building separate protected cycling facilities. I mean, we're talking about mega bucks. And I would certainly hope, I mean, he spoke at the League of American Bicycling, I guess it was a webinar conference, and very much in favor of bicycling as a sustainable mode of transportation. He's big into sustainability. So, I mean, no one can predict, well, exactly what's going to get done, because it has to also then be approved by Congress. But I think that in this Biden administration, and especially with Pete Buttigieg being the Secretary of Transportation, his heart is in the right place in putting money, well, that's a weird sort of a combination, putting money into that heart, putting billions of dollars into this, into improving cycling conditions. And we hope that his administration will. I think that there's a higher probability now, I'd say, than ever before, because of this new commitment to spend, I can't remember, $3 to $4 trillion on upgrading infrastructure overall in the United States. So there's enough there certainly for improving bicycling facilities, and we hope they'll follow through.
I think, I mean, the great thing is that the transport secretary was a mayor, so he actually understands these things. He knows about roads, he knows about bikeways, about scooters. Most other transport secretaries didn't have that background, so that's fantastic, and he seems to speak in the direction of promoting these modes. There are a couple of other things that can interfere with this. One is the availability of funds that will depend on the next transportation bill from Congress, or a big infrastructure bill, and how that money is to be spent or can be spent flexibly on the local level to also invest it in walking and cycling. And then the second element is that in the past, the US has had a tradition to, when they increased funding for walking and cycling, they often also increased transport funding overall. So we still kept building more roadways and then spending more on roads. We spent more on bikeways, which was great. But I think at some point we also have to get to a point where we start spending less on expanding roadways and restricting car use in places. And Mayor Pete is talking that direction, but it will depend on how the money comes out of Congress and how it is sort of channeled from there and how much he can do about it. And the last point are the guidelines that exist, the engineering guidelines to build bikeway facilities and to allow bikeway facilities, and how to set speed limits. They have to be changed and they have to become more bike friendly. We have a new bikeway guide from AASHTO coming out hopefully soon that will provide more guidance on safer and better bike facilities. We have an update of the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, the MUTCD, that can change things to the better. But these are things that are a little bit, I think DOT can have some influence, but a little bit outside of the influence of the Transport Secretary. But he needs the right standards and the right guidelines for the local level to implement safe facilities.
I'd like to say something. Carlton, those of you who don't know, is a journalist with Forbes magazine. And I think journalists play an absolutely crucial role in getting the message over to the public and to politicians. So Carlton, we are depending on you to get the word out here in the United States about the importance of cycling and the need to spend some of these trillions of dollars of infrastructure funds on improved cycling facilities and other complementary programs. So I'd like to thank Carlton for all the work he's done already. And he's written many, many articles for Forbes to promote cycling. And you just have no idea how important that is, Carlton. Thank you very much.
Okay, and we have one last question of today before we close out. That is from Devin Jackson. Devin, I'm allowing you to speak. I just need you to unmute and you will be good to go.
Hello, everybody. I'm Devin Jackson. Hopefully you all can hear me. I'm actually the son of Richard Jackson, Dr. Richard Jackson, and I'm also a middle school science teacher, 6th grade science teacher. And I'm on today because I think complete streets and safe bike routes to local areas around the house is very important, especially since I'm a teacher. Safe bike routes to schools. And you might have touched on this, but I was just wondering if you have any suggestions for how to improve safe bike routes to school, please.
Ralph?
For safe routes to school, there are a couple of aspects. The first is to start planning bikeways with the school at its center. So this can be the school district, this can be the PTA, or I guess it can also come from teachers or from the police to sort of think about where are the students located, what are the routes they take, how can they get to school safely. Often it requires some convincing of the police to put in these facilities. At least where I live, that's the case. But looking at the routes that are taken to school and trying to identify safe routes to school, and then at the school building to provide bike parking, maybe also safe bike parking. This could be sheltered bike parking that the bicycles do not get wet. Also providing bike training in schools, getting children interested in cycling and giving them the tools to be effective cyclists, in the sense that they know the traffic rules, that they know how to ride a bike and how to navigate traffic, giving them confidence and giving the parents more confidence. And then along those routes, I would also engage in driver education, that drivers are alert that children are cycling there and that they have to be at their best behavior.
I agree with all of that. But I think one of the points you first made, something that's crucial, is for any transportation bike planner for a city, that they explicitly should take into account the location of schools when they are designing their bikeway networks, and especially when they're designing the protected, physically separated bikeways. Those are especially important for children, and to keep that in mind. I mean, that should be one of the main criteria that they have in terms of locating these various protected cycling facilities.
Yeah, that reminds me of
good point.
Of a study that John mentioned to me. I think about was it cycling to school in Denmark, and it showed that physical activity on the way to school in Denmark was very, very important for the learning outcomes of the children. So getting physical activity in the morning before getting to school is very, very important for children and for their learning in school.
So let me just give you the specifics of that study, and that is children who cycle, these are, I think it was elementary school, but children who cycle to school, their mental alertness was increased more than it was by eating breakfast. That was one example. And the second was children who cycled to school had a level of mental alertness and ability when they got to school that was 2 grades higher, 2 classes higher than their own class. That it really, really sharpened their minds, helped them think more clearly. So not only is it physically healthy, it really is great for helping kids think better and performing better in the classroom. There's nothing, yeah, truly, as we said at the beginning of this presentation, cycling is truly a divine mode of transportation. It's perfect in every way.
I think that's a perfect way to close out our session today. I want to thank everyone so very much for joining us for our last webinar for the webinar series for Florida Bike Month. And I want to thank again both of our presenters, John and Ralph, for doing an incredible job providing this information to everyone who was available and able to join us today. Thank you guys so much.
You're
Thank you
very
for having
welcome. And
us.
thanks to all of the participants in the webinar. I mean, we wouldn't be giving this without you. So, and thanks to Alyssa. She has done a great job coordinating this whole thing. You have no idea all the work she's done. So thanks to everybody.
Yeah, thank
Happy
you.
cycling.
Thank you guys. Oh, and one last reminder, I will have a recording posted to our website at palmbeachtpa.org/meetings. And that should be up hopefully by the end of this week, but it will be available on there for any colleagues or anyone who might have missed it, or if you want to rewatch. So just keep an eye out there.
Could you repeat it for them? Palm Beach TPA.
Yes, PALM Beach, BEACH TPA.org and then /meetings. If you have any trouble at all accessing that, my email was included in the Zoom link, so just do not hesitate to reach out to me. But thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your day and rest of your week.